Our next speaker is Dr. Ajilore. He is the University of Illinois Center for Depression and Resilience professor in the Department of Psychiatry at University of Illinois Chicago, UIC. He graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University with a degree in biology. Dr. Ajilore went on to do his MD PhD degree at Stanford University, where he studied the deleterious effects of stress hormones on the brain. He joined the research track residency at UCLA, where he transitioned into neuroimaging and in major depression. His lab currently uses computational neuroimaging techniques and digital biomarkers to better track and treat neuropsychiatric disorders. Dr. Ajilore also serves as the associate head for faculty development and the director of Mood and Anxiety Disorders program.
Thank you. I don't know if the people on Zoom can hear me. I just want to make sure. Okay, and as a segue from the previous talk, I agree that Twitter is very academic. I'm on Twitter quite a bit, but I would say that aspects of med Twitter are also kind of like high school. It's pretty gossipy from what I've seen, and I'm glad that I'm not in medical school and on Twitter at the same time, because it seems like a lot of drama sometimes.
The microphone might help you pick it up.
Okay. All right. How's this?
Yeah, good.
All right.
Adjust the Zoom PowerPoint, which is showing it different.
Oh, okay. All right. So today I'm going to talk about some of the research that we've done looking at real world assessment of mood and cognitive states using technology, and talk about what the implications are for the future of psychiatry. Basically, how will it influence the way you guys get a chance to practice as psychiatrists? Here are my disclosures. We've commercialized some of the work that we've done in forming a company called QWise AI, and the work that I'm going to talk about was funded by NIMH and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And since we're here at Loyola, I thought it would be good to start off with a Bible quote, talking about what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again, and there's nothing new under the sun. So this is just to highlight the fact that what I'm going to be talking about is about the future and about technology, but it's actually rooted in some very old ideas and old concepts. So this is a excerpt from the American Journal of Psychiatry, published in 1891. And in this article about the mechanisms of insanity, they talk about the fact that, the best way that we can actually get to know our patients, this empirical evaluation, comes from the ability to kind of tirelessly observe our patients, observe their actions, observe their behaviors, observe their feelings. And then by that way of observation, we get a more complete and precise view of what's going on with our patients. So this was mentioned way back in 1891. Here's another relevant quote from the Lancet in 1859, when they talk about the fact that when we're observing our patients in the hospital setting, back in the day it was the asylum, we're removing them from the context by which the disease arose, right? They're not in their neighborhoods, they're not in their families, they're sort of in isolation. And that when we're trying to figure out what's happening with our patients in this isolated state, in the inpatient setting, that we're only sort of guessing at what's going on with our patient. We don't really have a good sense of what were the factors, what were the contextual issues that might have contributed to this patient's psychosis, their depression, their anxiety. And so what's different now is that we have a lot of tools for this tireless observation in this type of context, whether it's smartwatches, Alexa speakers, Nest cameras, thermometers, smartphones, and we have all of these smart connected devices that are smart because they're connected to each other and they sense our environment, but they can also sense us. And we can take advantage of the way that they sense us to get insights into how we're feeling and how we're thinking. And so we describe this in our lab as sort of a network of connected devices that allow us to get a better sense of how we're doing from a psychiatric standpoint. And the technical term around this is called ecological momentary assessment, which is the ability to capture with high temporal resolution behavior, attitudes, emotions in real world environments, in the context in which these behaviors, feelings occur. And so the motivation is that the way we currently assess patients, especially when looking at assessing mood and cognition, is that it's subject to all kinds of biases. So there are recall bias, right? They can't remember. You know, you're asking, oh, how have you been over the last couple of weeks or since the last time I saw you, right? And they might just report what happened that morning. And that's recency bias, right? So let's say they've been doing really well on the medication that you're prescribing for them, but they got into a car accident on the way to your office. They're not going to be feeling really good, right? And that can affect and color your assessment of how they're responding to your medication. The other one is that it's asynchronous. We're not getting it at the time that people are experiencing these things. And so, you know, we're asking people, you know, how they did 2 weeks ago, a couple months ago. We're not getting the information in real time. And then it's subjective, related to those biases that I talked about. And then we're also asking about these things in artificial settings. We're not capturing them in real world environments where the behavior really matters. And so here's a couple of examples of where people have applied these tools to our understanding of different psychiatric disorders. This is a study by Kim and colleagues, where what they did was they looked at the amount of activity that people were engaged in using an actigraph watch, right? And they compared patients with late life depression to controls. And you could see that over the course of the day, particularly in the middle of the day, that patients with depression had significantly less activity compared to controls without depression. And that makes sense, right? Some of the symptoms of depression include lack of energy, decreased activity. And so we can actually capture that with these types of devices. Here's another really cool study that came out of the NIMH, where they looked at a community sample of folks both with and without psychiatric disorders. They equipped everybody with an actigraphy device to look at their activity. And they also pinged them multiple times a day to ask them questions about their energy level and their mood. And what they wanted to do was to see, okay, does one measure, activity, sleep patterns, predict changes in another measure, how you're feeling, how much energy that you have? And what they found was that in the patients that had psychiatric disorders, so some of them had bipolar disorder, some of them had major depression, increased motor activity was predictive of decreased sad mood. So the more active you were, the happier you were the next day, right? And that makes sense. And that fits what we tell our patients when we talk about behavioral activation techniques, right? That one of the ways to break the cycle of not feeling like you're too depressed to do things that you typically enjoy, and you do less of those activities, and because you do less of those activities, you feel more depressed. So one of the ways to break that vicious cycle is to just say, don't wait till you feel better to engage in these pleasurable, fun things that you like to do, just do them. And then the idea is that your mood will improve as a result. And this is evidence towards that increased activity on day one predicts better mood on day two. The other thing is that they found that increased activity was associated with greater changes in mood, energy, and sleep duration. Just a personal example, I have a Samsung 4, Galaxy Watch 4, and there's, you know, a typical night for me, I didn't sleep very well. And my watch actually made the link and said, you know, you weren't really active the day before you had this really bad night of sleep. And studies show that if you have more activity, you'll get a better night's sleep. And so that's how we're taking this kind of data and turning it into insights for a patient. And so again, what this suggests is that just increasing motor activity, exercise is a great antidepressant. And this is a sort of evidence showing that. And that is actually a kind of low cost, high yield intervention for a lot of patients. Here's another study showing how we can use these smart devices to kind of ping people and ask how they're doing. They found that when they did these cognitive tests on an Apple Watch, as well as asking people how they felt, that they actually had high levels of adherence. And so in our work, what we've done is link these types of passive and EMA measures to looking at brain function. And we've done it in a couple studies that are ongoing now that I'll talk about. One is called Rembrandt for folks with late life depression, and the other one is called Unmasked, where we're looking at people across the spectrum of mood disorders. The first study, Rembrandt, it's an acronym for recurrence markers, cognitive burden, and neurobiological homeostasis in late life depression. And what we're trying to do is to see if we can use brain imaging as well as Fitbit data, ecological momentary assessment to predict who is going to relapse. So once we've treated somebody, they're in remission, there's a high rate of relapse, particularly for older adults with depression. About 40% will relapse in a 2-year period. And so what we want to do is to say, can we figure out what are the clues, what are the signals, what are the flags that will tell me that my patient is going to be in trouble, so that I can intervene early and prevent that from happening. And the two things that we think are important are affective instability. So basically, if people have really great moods on one day, poor moods on the next day, and it's very labile. And the other one is cognitive decline or cognitive dysfunction. If people are having increasing problems with working memory, attention, concentration over time, we think that's going to be one of those flags that predicts who's going to end up with a recurrence of depression. And here's the basic model. As I mentioned, we're looking at cognitive decline, affective instability, and that affective instability we think is actually reflected in what's happening in the brain. So we're going to be using functional MRI to look at activity and the stability of that activity in the brain while doing cognitive tasks and emotionally stressing tasks. And we're following people over that 2-year period where we expect about 40% of our patients to relapse. We're doing serial MRIs, we're doing serial ecological momentary assessments, and then our participants are wearing Fitbit, so we're looking at activity. And as I mentioned in that earlier study, we know how important activity is in maintaining a stable mood. So again, here are our approaches, Fitbit, and then here are some of the questions that we're asking with our ecological momentary assessment. In addition to asking about mood and stress and fatigue, we're also asking about their social context. Are you alone? Are you with other people? Because we know that social isolation, loneliness can be a major risk factor for depression in this population. We're also doing these mobile cognitive assessments, and some of these are sort of ecologically valid. So one is a price test memory. So you get a shopping list of items and associated costs, and you have to remember what items cost what amount. We're also doing a symbols test and grids test to look at processing speed and working memory. So the idea is that if we can, if we're successful with this study, not only will we identify what flags might be predictive of relapse in these patients, but we'll understand at the neural level why those flags are associated with relapse. And then we can think about better interventions to target that, to keep people well once you've treated them and they've gotten into remission. So I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions, because I also want to make sure that this is interactive. And if you have any questions about anything that I've talked about, you can feel free to ask. Yes, please.
I guess on that note of like sort of next steps, like have there been any talks on like utilizing some of this like some of these like pings to create interventions of like, hey, like like have you been exercising and does that act as a cue?
Absolutely. So what you just asked about is what we call just-in-time adaptive intervention. So we're taking advantage of the data that we're collecting to intervene at the time when we think it'll be most useful and most impactful. So the last study that I'm gonna talk about that we're engaged in is actually an intervention study that's smartphone based. So great question. So some of the pros and cons of using the ecological momentary assessment or doing smartphone tests on a smartphone cognitive test or smartwatch based cognitive test is that while it allows us to get this data in these real world settings and we can get it frequently, so we have high temporal sampling of information, it does require active engagement by the patient, right? They have to do the test, they have to answer the questions. And as a result, there can be very high attrition rates, right? So I don't know if any of you, how many of you have had experience with working with psychiatric patients yet, or are you still too early, all of you? So what might be some of the problems that occur if you start asking your patient, you know what, I think in order to get a sense of how well the medication is working, I'd like you to track your mood.
Patients will think that they're being watched and not give accurate feedback on how they're actually feeling, or they'll give feedback based on what they think you want to hear.
Right, right. So it might not be accurate. What might be some of the other problems?
Your depression is severe enough at a certain point, like you're not going to be answering like pings
Yeah.
or even wearing your watch.
Exactly. So yeah, so your answers highlight the two major problems, right? One, the information may not be accurate, and two, you may not even get the information at all, right? I can't tell you, it's countless number of patients that I've had who are very motivated to track their moods, but when they're feeling depressed, when they're feeling more manic, you think they're gonna stop and fill out a questionnaire? No. So you have very high attrition rates, and then we're not capturing the data at the very time we need it the most, right? When they're getting sick. And so what we've done is we've worked on passive ways of trying to get this data. Now, the actigraphy is one of those passive ways because they're just wearing a watch, right? And you're recording how active they are. So that's one of them. And the advantage is that, you know, it's unobtrusive, right? Like I'm just wearing this watch. I'm not noticing it while I'm talking to you, but it's collecting data, right? It's collecting my heart rate, it's collecting my steps, et cetera. It's continuous. And then it's reduced burden on the patient or the participant if you're doing it in a study. And so we have developed a method to do this in a study that we call Unmask, which stands for Unobtrusive Monitoring of Affective Symptoms and Cognition using keyboard dynamics. And again, the idea is to link what's happening in the brain with what we can measure with these smart connected devices. And what we're using is an app that was developed by my colleague shown here, Dr. Alex Liao. She developed an app called BiAffect, which replaces the default keyboard of your smartphone with a customized keyboard that allows us to track how you type. So we look at how fast you're typing, whether you make mistakes when you type, even the rhythm of your typing. All of that can yield information about mood and cognition. And importantly, because of privacy and confidentiality concerns, we're not recording what you type. And, you know, and there's a lot of valuable information in what people type, but, you know, we're trying to do more with less and do it in a way that's, you know, ethical and preserves patient privacy. So we were fortunate to work, one second. We were fortunate to work with the University of Michigan, and they have this longitudinal study of bipolar disorder. We had a bunch of their patients use the app on an Android phone. They did the daily EMA ratings, as well as clinician-rated scales of depression and mania. And in one of our first papers published by Dr. John Zulueta, who was a research track resident at the time, now is junior faculty, he found that the keyboard dynamics were significantly associated with clinician-rated scales of mania and depression. Furthermore, when you break it down into the different elements of the keyboard data, we found that backspace was uniquely associated with manic symptoms, so that the less backspace usage was associated with more manic symptoms. And then more autocorrect was associated with more depression, which kind of makes sense because we think this is related to paying attention or impulsivity or inattention. So here's a paper from Jonathan Stange, who's now a professor at USC. He was interested in looking at whether we could predict changes in depression with the keyboard data. And what he found was, let me go back. And so what he found was that if you look at the instability of the EMA ratings and the instability of the typing speed data, and you controlled for baseline symptoms, those were significantly associated with changes in depressive symptoms down the line. So basically, if you have instability of your typing speed now, that was predictive of more depression down the line. So we were fortunate in that a lot of these participants also did cognitive tests. So they did a trail making test and a Tower of London task. And we wanted to see if we can use the typing data to predict cognitive function. And so here's the trail making test. If you're familiar with it, it's basically a connect the dots task. Part A is just connecting numbers in sequence. Part B is doing letter number sequencing, and it's a test of processing speed for part A and executive function for part B. And in work published by our graduate student, Mindy Ross, she looked at key presses that were done in the morning in association with doing the trail making test in the morning, and key presses done in the evening associated with people doing the trail making test in the evening. And then she controlled for a number of various factors, but she was interested to see if typing speed was associated with processing speed as measured by the time it takes to complete the connect the dots trail making task. And what she found was, yes, it does. It's highly associated. So the slower you type, the slower your performance was on the trail making test. And this was sort of across subjects. And what was really cool was that in between, within subjects, she found that to be the case, right? Because everybody did it twice a day for multiple days. And she found that association that if you were slow today with your typing, you would be slow today with your trail making test. But if you're faster the next day with your typing, you were faster on the trail making test. So that's really evidence suggesting that we're actually capturing cognitive function with typing data. The other way we can look at the typing data is we can characterize it as a time series. And this is an approach that's been used to understand other aspects of medicine like postural sway and Parkinson's disease, or looking at EKG data and cardiology. And so when we characterize the keyboard data as a time series, what we're looking at is how fast you're typing a key as a function of the key press order. So you get this sort of time series that looks like an EKG or it looks like an EEG. And we can look at the randomness or the regularity of this signal, right? And the way we do that is to measure something called entropy. And we also wanted to tie it to the time series of moves on the Tower of London task. So if you're not familiar with the Tower of London task, the idea is to get from a start state to a goal state in as few moves as possible. And what we did was we looked at the time it took to go in between each move, right? And so the idea is that if you thought about how to solve this puzzle, you might have a long time one for your first move, but all your subsequent steps should be pretty regular because you thought it out in your head how you're going to solve the puzzle. But let's say you're impulsive and you're trying to do this because it's a timed test too. And you said, okay, I want to do this as fast as I can. And so you make a quick first move, you realize you screwed up. Then the second move might be a little bit slower. And then you realize that you didn't quite think this out. So it's going to be irregular, those move times, right? And so we can measure that in terms of entropy of those move times. And so if it's regular, it's low entropy. If it's irregular, high entropy. And we can do that with the typing. So the time it takes in between key presses, we can look at the regularity or the entropy of those times. And so if you're typing at a regular rhythm, it's going to be low entropy. If it's more irregular, high entropy. And our hypothesis was that patients with bipolar disorder tend to demonstrate a lot of impulsivity, right, as part of their symptom profile, and that would be reflected in the irregularity of move times on the Tower of London task and the irregularity of their typing. Furthermore, we hypothesized that those two things might actually be related. And so first of all, we looked at the entropy of move times on the Tower of London task, and we found that it was significantly higher for the bipolar patients compared to the controls. And the same thing was true for the key presses. And what we did was we used something called multi-scale entropy, which allows us to measure entropy across different time scales because we have so much typing data and we don't know like how much typing data is the right amount. So we looked at it across multiple scales, and across all scales that we looked at, the entropy was significantly higher for the bipolar patients compared to controls. Furthermore, that typing entropy was highly correlated with entropy on the Tower of London task, and it was correlated with variability of depressive symptoms and impulsive actions and feelings. All right. So in this pilot study that we did with the University of Michigan, it showed that we can use these kind of passive, unobtrusive measures to look at cognitive function and to look at mood. And so now we're doing this study called Unmask. Based on that pilot data where we're recruiting patients across the spectrum of mood disorders. They're using the app for a month, and then during that month, we're doing clinical assessments, cognitive assessments, and MRIs. And we want to see if what we measure in the brain tracks with what we measure on the phone. And here's basically the study design. Everybody gets scanned twice, and they get multiple assessments that we can use to validate what we're getting off the BioEffect app. And here's an example of some of our hypotheses. So I demonstrated prior data showing that typing speed is associated with processing speed. And we think that that processing speed is associated with alterations in the structure of brain networks, such as impaired network efficiency. So our lab and others have shown that processing speed is associated with brain network efficiency. So the more efficiently your brain is connected, the better your processing speed. And so we're trying to make the link between those things. And here's some preliminary data from like the first 10 subjects. So this is very early from our Unmasked study, where on the x-axis, you're looking at typing speed, which is measured by inter-key delay, the timing in between key presses, and the y-axis is global efficiency. And what we're showing here in the first 10 subjects is that the better your network efficiency, the better your typing speed, the faster your typing speed. So suggesting that what we're measuring in the brain does track to some degree with what we're measuring by the phone. All right, any questions here before I get into this last study? Yes.
Hello, I just had some question about the logistics of the study.
Mhm.
So in order to participate, does the patient have to have a smartphone? Do you give them a smartphone?
Yeah, great question. So when deciding to plan this study and thinking about aspects of study design, if we give everybody a study phone, you have more reliable data, right? You don't have to worry about issues with the operating system or the version of the operating system, but it's less generalizable. If you allow people to use their own phone, then it's more generalizable. And so we opted for that option. So if you have an Android phone, if you have an iOS phone, an iPhone, you can participate in the study. Yes.
My first question is about the way that you use time on the phone,
Mhm.
if at all. Because I could consider like someone spending 15 hours a day on their phone.
Oh, yeah.
Do you use that as a measure at all?
So we haven't. What we've done is to look at typing activity on the phone as just a general measure of sort of circadian patterns, right? Because phones tend to be the first thing we pick up and the last thing we put down. So what we can look at is whether there's a lot of activity that's sort of off cycle. And we think that that might be an important marker, especially in cases like bipolar disorder where you have decreased need for sleep. So if you see somebody who normally doesn't use their phone at 3 a.m. and suddenly they're using their phone all the time at 3 a.m., then of course we think that's an important signal.
You were saying that the backspace is correlated with
Manic
severity of
symptoms.
manic symptoms.
Mhm.
How did you measure the manic symptoms? What was the-
So there was a Young Mania Rating Scale, which is a standard clinical scale for mania. Mhm. Yes.
Your study participants would change their behavior after having this on the
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And so what you're referring to is the Hawthorne effect, right? Which is actually a factory here in Illinois. We don't know, actually. So if it does, then the question is self-monitoring an intervention in and of itself? And there's a lot of clinical sort of anecdotal evidence to suggest that it is, right? If I pay attention to my step count, do I start increasing my step count? Is sort of the idea. And we don't know. Yeah, but it's a good question. It's something that we've thought about, but it's something that we have to look at more formally. All right, So I'm gonna end with a discussion of getting back to the question about intervention, right? And so this is a study that I engaged in with a colleague of mine, Dr. June Ma, who's actually in internal medicine. And we were interested in thinking about ways we can deliver a form of therapy called problem-solving therapy with a coach that would be based on the Alexa platform. And so that was the genesis of this study called SPEAK, where we recruited people with mild to moderate depression and anxiety. And the design at the core of SPEAK is the app itself called Lumen, which works off a tablet to deliver these problem-solving therapy sessions. And it works in coordination with the participant's smartphone, which is what we use to measure EMA surveys, and also to look at the progression that patients had. So sort of related to that last question, we would give people feedback on how they were doing after each session. We thought that that was a good way of encouraging them to continue participation if they see that the sessions are working to reduce their anxiety and their depressive symptoms. So we gave them some feedback, and then we also used it to handle some of the logistics of the scheduling of the PhD sessions. And then the goal was for them to do this over a 16-week period. And here's the flow chart. So after recruiting and screening participants, and we gave them orientation to the actual study, we would do baseline surveys looking at measures of mood and cognition, as well as worry. And we also looked at their baseline problem-solving skills with a scale called SPSI, the social problem-solving inventory. And we also looked at their attitudes with the dysfunctional attitude scale. And then we were interested in seeing if we can link these sort of survey reports and subjective measures with more objective-based brain measures. So we're looking at activity in two circuits. One was a negative affect circuit made up of the amygdala and the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex. And these were used in the context of task-based fMRI studies. So it was a non-conscious threat task where you're flashing different types of faces at the participant while they're in the scanner, and you're looking at activation in these regions, which tend to respond to threatening stimuli. And then we're also interested in cognitive control circuits. So these are the circuits responsible for emotion regulation and executive function, and include the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is also the target for RTMS treatment. And so those were our neural targets for this intervention. And the reason why we had these neural targets for the intervention is that this particular study was funded by a mechanism called an R61-R33. And this is a new sort of approach by NIMH to design intervention studies where it's not enough to say, oh, okay, my intervention improves depression symptoms or anxiety symptoms or reduces hallucinations and delusions. You have to show how it does that, right? And so the first step is a 2-year pilot where you show that your intervention affects a target that you hypothesize is involved in the treatment's effect, right? And here we hypothesize that problem-solving therapy decreases the response to threatening stimuli as measured by reduced activation in the amygdala and subgenual cingulate, and it also enhances cognitive control, emotion regulation. And we think that those changes in the brain are then related to improvements in problem-solving ability, a decrease in negative affect, which then has subsequent benefits for depression and anxiety symptoms. But first we have to show that it affects these neural targets. And if we show that, then we can move on to a clinical trial to look at the clinical outcomes. So it's a whole new way of thinking about intervention studies that NIMH has sort of enforced on the research community through this funding mechanism. But I think the idea is that after many, many years of not really making progress with treatments in psychiatry, we need to do things in a different way. And we need to do it in a way that informs better intervention development and refinement. One of the things that we deal with in psychiatric disorders is heterogeneity. right? But we often have one size fits all solutions, which doesn't really work for our patients. So if we can come up with these targets for our interventions, then we can think about how do we use these targets to stratify our patients, to select our patients for the most appropriate treatments. And so that's the whole idea behind this study design. And so after we do these baseline assessments and MRI scans, they get randomized to interacting with Lumen for 14 weeks, or they're put on a waitlist control for 14 weeks, and then we do follow-up surveys and imaging. And we've just finished the 2-year pilot. We've done our initial analyses. Because this is recorded, I couldn't show you any actual data yet because it's just brand new, but I'm very happy to say that for a couple of our targets, we showed that the intervention does work to change dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity and decreases activity in the subgenual cingulate. And we saw enhancement in problem-solving ability for patients who were in the Lumen arm. Furthermore, we see that there were decreases in depression and anxiety symptoms in the intervention arm compared to the control group. So we're very excited about that. We'll be able to move on based on this preliminary data. We'll move on to the clinical trial. But one of the most exciting things, I think, about what our study has shown and what I hope bears out moving on is that we actually did a moderation analysis to see what are the factors that were most associated with response to Lumen. And it turns out that in our study population, it was non-white women with less than a college education that actually did the best. And so it's really exciting to think about how, this is relatively low cost. It can work on anybody's smartphone. Alexa is free to download. And so we're really excited that we have this potential low cost, high tech solution to addressing some of the barriers involved in access to care, particularly for vulnerable populations. So I will end with just the whole hope and like what I just talked about is that the idea that we can use this technology to basically help people before they get into trouble, intervene early, and have better outcomes for our patients. So with that, I just want to acknowledge like all the people that were involved in the work that I talked about for the SPEAK and Rembrandt and math studies. And so I want to make sure I leave enough time for questions. Thanks.
I had a question. I don't know if you can hear me in the computer. I'm a third-year medical student at NYT, and I was just listening to your research and
Yeah, how do you see this? 'Cause so these are really amazing studies. I'm curious if you see this like and how fitting into the future of psychiatry, like the way like physicians and psychiatrists.
Yeah. So, so there's already a whole realm of development in the area called digital therapeutics. We have a couple of FDA approved digital therapeutics. So Pear has one for opiate use disorder. Achilles Therapeutics has one for ADHD. It's a video game. And so in addition to prescribing Prozac, or you can prescribe an app, right? So I think that is going to be a major change in how we practice, is that we'll have additional tools in our therapeutic toolbox beyond medication and therapy. And those additional tools are these digital therapeutics. So I think that's one way. Another way is a lot of my research over the years have been focused on using neuroimaging. And for a long time, there's been a lot of hype and a lot of overpromising about the role of neuroimaging in clinical practice. But I think we're getting closer to a more rational use of neuroimaging. And one example is really exciting work coming out of Stanford with their accelerated TMS protocol, SAINT, that utilizes neuroimaging, first of all, to enhance targeting of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But then they're able to get people who were treatment resistant to ECT, TMS, standard TMS, medications, they're responding to this. And I think one of the reasons why they're responding to it is because we're using their own brain connectivity and their own brain patterns to customize the treatment. And that's another general theme that I think you'll see more of when you're in practice is customization of treatment. As I said, we have one size fits all, and then we do trial and error, which is really annoying, more annoying for our patients, right? And so think about the ability to do a blood test, to do a neuroimaging test, right? Whether it's pharmacogenomics or something else that tells you exactly what this person is going to respond best to, right? Think about what they do in oncology, right? They get all the genetics about the tumor and they can come up with a very custom treatment for that patient. That's where we're going with psychiatry, using genetic information, using neuroimaging, using the digital biomarker data, right? To come up with just-in-time interventions like your activity levels are low, and if you increase your activity levels, you'll have more energy, better sleep, and better mood, right? So I think we'll be able to think about more contextual types of treatments too, as well. Yes.
I have a question regarding these interventions. I know they're on the newer side of development, and there's different kinds, but I'm just wondering, is the idea to kind of have a longer term follow-up to these patients taking these interventions? Like, is it expected the patient will forever be on this intervention? Or is it a short term, kind of like constructing the brain and how we process things, and then after that, the patient doesn't need to have these interventions anymore?
Again, I think that goes back to customization, right? So if you look at just pharmacotherapy for depression, there's some people that have a single episode of depression, they take medications, they go into remission, and they never need and they can taper off the medication and they'll never need medication again. There are other people that if they try that, their depression is going to come right back, right? So I think it really depends that, whatever the outcomes are in the prognosis is really going to depend on the individual patient. But the idea is that we're going to have better treatments tailored to that, and we'll have more predictive power to figure out which bucket a patient falls into. Are you the type that's, I can just treat you for this single episode and you're going to be fine? Because right now we don't know, right? The only way we find out is that the patient says, I'd like to try stopping, and they stop and then they get depressed again.
You might have gotten a question in the chat.
Oh. I don't know if I can. Let's see if I can see the chat.
Well, actually, you did receive it. Someone who would like to ask an anonymous question through the chat.
Oh, sure.
They would like to know about what protections are being made to help protect emotional data for these clients, and if there's any kind of protection so that information isn't being used for advertising or businesses.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and that's something that because we have a commercial aspect to what we've done. We have a startup to commercialize some of the work that we've done with the BioEffect app, and that's something that we take very seriously. Is data privacy and security. And so one of the things that we've done in the commercial version of what we've done in the lab is switch from doing analysis of data on a server to on-device machine learning and analysis. So nothing personal or private leaves your phone. Everything is done on device. So that's one way. The other thing, as I mentioned, we don't capture what people are typing, right? So the things that are being recorded are how fast you're typing, the time in between key presses, but not what key presses. So we're not capturing any sensitive kind of information. And then the kind of sensitive information that we could get from that typing data is what is just kept on the user's phone. So that's one way, but it is really important. I'll give you an example of why it's really important. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the crisis text line. So they recently got in some trouble, or at least there was some controversy because they partnered with a company that they own, which does machine learning analyses on the content of what people are typing to the crisis text line to better, to develop like basically customer service AI. And people are really upset about that, that you're taking advantage of people at a moment when they're most vulnerable, using the data that they've generated for profit. So does that, oh, it's anonymous, I don't know if that answers the first question. Yes.
Do you foresee yourself or your team partnering up with technological companies, software or phone companies to make this more available to the average therapy consumer?
Yeah. I mean, we've on the company side, we've talked to them all. Yeah.
Are any big ones interested?
They're interested. Some of them think it's too early to tell. Apple's already sort of, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about Apple being involved with a study at UCLA as part of their grant challenge for depression project. But it's funny, when that was announced and was reported in the Wall Street Journal, when I looked at the responses on Twitter, they were uniformly negative because of the concerns that were brought up by the previous question. So that's why getting the privacy thing is so crucial. So I mean, you're talking about mental health, you're talking about very personal, private things. And so, one of the arguments that I made when people said, are people really gonna wanna do this? Well, if you look at the adoption of our study, people are willing to sign up. I mean, people want solutions, people want ways to better self-manage their emotional states. And the argument that I've made is that we already give up so much information to Google, to Meta, to Apple, to all these companies so that they can sell us stuff. Why not use that information to enhance our own health? Any other questions? Yes.
I was just curious, some of the characteristics of your study.
Yeah, so for the Rembrandt study, since it's a late life depression study, everybody there is 60 years of age and older. For the MASK study, we're looking at people between the ages of 25 and 50. And then for the SPEAK study, I think that was 21 to 60.
Since all the data is collected on the person's phone, so that means you can't receive it or see changes in real time, is that correct?
Well, so this is, I have to be careful what I say, but there's ways in the company side, there are ways that we're thinking about making sure that folks have control over who has access to that data. So if you want to share it with somebody, you can. But the idea is that you as the user have control over who sees your data, what aspects of your data get shared.
And without the sharing, would the interventions just be things that pop up on the phone that you can interact with the phone?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like the example of my watch, basically just saying, you had less activity on this day, you had poor sleep that night. If you increase your activity, you're going to get better sleep. Yes.
This might be too broad a question, but you're doing longitudinal research on mood in the Midwest where it's really cold and winter. Do you see season playing a role in level of activity patients are doing?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question, and you've given me an idea for secondary analysis once we've collected all the data, right? Is to see if there are seasonal effects. But yeah, I mean, I definitely see it in my clinical practice. That's why I recommend everybody get a light box. But yeah, that's a really good idea. I'm going to check that out and see if there are differences in the patients that we recruit in the winter versus those that we recruit in the summer. Yes.
Sorry, so many questions.
No problem.
Do you foresee the app of sharing their information with their friends?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think ultimately, and this is another way, going back to how this will impact the future of psychiatry and clinical practice, is that you can imagine all of this data collected, not just by our app, but let's say by your smartwatch, your Apple Watch, whatever, being integrated into the electronic health record, right? So that when you see your patient, you'll get a nice chart of how they were doing in between visits. Because there's a lot of evidence in general that measurement-based care leads to better outcomes. And I've seen it in my own clinical practice. So instead of doing, this nice fancy stuff with the technology, you just have people do these surveys and scales in the clinic at every visit. And when you do that, you can give feedback to the patient so that they can have a little bit of distance from what's going on and have a better view of, like, for example, how they're responding to medication. I mean, I'll give you an example where I had a patient who was on, I think she was on sertraline, and she didn't feel like it was really doing much. And then I was able to pull out the chart to show where she was before she started the medication and where she is now. And that really gave her perspective and more buy-in into the treatment plan of staying on the medication. So that's some of the ways that measurement-based care can really make a difference in clinical practice. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
All right, y'all, it's lunchtime. We'll head over to the cafeteria in a second, and we'll have some free sandwiches over there.
Dr. Ajilore, I just wanted to say that was my question earlier, and thanks for asking it, or thanks for answering it.
Oh, wait. Did somebody have a question? You could try again.
It was just me. I was just saying thanks for, it was supposed to be anonymous. I was trying to ask it over Zoom earlier. I was just trying to thank Dr. Ajilore for answering my question. I really appreciated it.
No problem.
We're your med student at NYT.
All right, great. Thanks for that good question.
There you go. Inspiration.
For those who are online, we're going to get started again in about an hour. So the link will be open for everybody to join back on. So have a nice lunch.
A little gift from us.
Oh, great, thank you.